The Dream. Nobody in Chuck's circle was in much of a laughing mood lately. Strange things had been happening in their hometown. Chuck always quipped how he'd love for something exciting to happen in Mill Valley sometime this century. But this wasn't what he had in mind, not even in his most outlandish comedic fantasies. First, Tommy Milner went missing. Whew, that Tommy Milner, I tell ya, Chuck once ripped during lunch in the school cafeteria. If you look up the word bully in the dictionary, you'll see Tommy's picture, right between body odor and bumbling. Tommy had strutted into the cafeteria, right in the middle of the punchline. Tommy beat the shit out of Chuck that day and gave him such a severe wedgie that Chuck groaned he could still taste the fruit of the loom weeks later. But Chuck got the last laugh a few nights ago, on Halloween, when he filled a brown paper bag with his own turd, lit it on fire, and tossed the foul flaming thing into Tommy's Pontiac Catalina. Now that was funny. That was the most legendary prank Chuck had ever pulled, even better than the cherry bomb toilet explosions at Camp Tacony a few summers ago. That was also the last night Chuck, or anyone, had seen Tommy Milner. Then, one day later, Chuck's best pal Augie also vanished. Augie had always been the straight man to Chuck's Jester, the Martin to his Lewis, the chocolate to Chuck's peanut butter. Chuck would routinely bring Augie down a peg or two whenever he'd start rambling about some Italian player dim sum restaurant or whatever, but Augie never got too sore over the ribbing. Chuck always thought Augie got a kick out of their banter like he was saying his comeback lines with a wink. Augie may have been a snob, but he was a loyal friend. Numerous times, too many to count, he had pulled Chuck's fat out of the fire. Even as recently as this Halloween, Augie was there for Chuck. After they and Stella ambushed Tommy Milner's car, and Tommy chased them all the way to the old Bellows place, Chuck got separated from his friends inside the foreboding mansion. Sure, it started as another of Chuck's tricks, only it turned out that the trick was on him. He decided to play a quick round of surprise hide-and-seek with Augie. Chuck always loved to tweak Augie when he was nervous, and the creepy Bellows place was making everyone nervous. So Chuck snuck to the second floor of the rundown estate and hid in an antique of one of the upstairs bedrooms. He waited for Augie to walk past obliviously, then opened the door. Only when Chuck did, he found that the bedroom was no longer in a shambles, but somehow restored to its original ornate condition. Nor was Chuck alone. An impossibly gaunt old woman in a black lace gown and veil sat in repose along the bed. At the foot of the bed, the meanest black dog Chuck had ever seen stared back at him, as if sizing up Chuck for the kill. The old woman rapped her walking stick against the hardwood floor 3 times, and Chuck flinched so hard he nearly pissed his pants. He retreated back into the dresser and shut the door. The door started rattling from the outside, and Chuck held on for dear life. But when Chuck finally lost the tug of war and the dresser opened again, it wasn't the hellhound, it was Augie. "My hero," Chuck mentally deadpanned. The next night, Augie disappeared too. Chuck noticed that losing his best friend had given his latest jokes more of an edge. The setups grew grimmer, the payoffs sharper, and more provocative. Stella was long past humor at this point, and Ruth had never suffered her little brother's brand of comedy for the entire time he'd known her. Now Ruth was gone too. Chuck startled awake from another dream. He found himself on a northbound bus. Stella and that guy they met on Halloween, Ramon, were seated nearby, leaning against each other and looking out the window at the passing fields. Chuck saw how they were holding hands, that damned book from the Bellows place next to their interwoven fingers. The very sight of the book's frayed leather binding, its faded end papers, its blood-red script, made Chuck's skin crawl. It instantly reminded him of the nightmare he'd just left. The dream on the bus had been the same as the last. The pale, plump woman, the black eyes and tangle of hair, the red room. Chuck shuddered involuntarily and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. He noticed that the driver was slowing. Peering past Stella and Ramon, and through the window, Chuck saw the bus turn onto the grounds of a sprawling stone structure. They passed a sign that read, "The New Penhurst Hospital." For some reason, the sight of the impassive complex and its barred windows made Chuck think of a nursery rhyme he'd recently heard. The worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. Maybe Chuck recalled the song because of the crazy old lady who had muttered it to him. The worms play pinochle on your snout. She seemed like she could have been a former patient at Penhurst, one who escaped before the doctors ever found a cure. They'll eat your ears, they'll eat your nose, they'll eat the jelly between your toes. Of course, the demented woman had never been a patient at Penhurst, but it had been her idea that Stella, Ramon, and Chuck visit the hospital. Don't ever laugh as the hearse goes by. Senile though she may have been, the elderly lady told them that Penhurst held the answers to the book they'd found, and to the fates it had foretold, fates that had befallen everyone else who'd been with them at the Bellows place. You may be the next to die. The bus came to a stop, its shot brakes releasing a shrill metal-on-metal squeal that set Chuck's teeth on edge. He, Stella, and Ramon got off and made their way to the main building. A thick patina of overgrown ivy gave the hospital's facade an ancient appearance. It seemed as if it had been there for centuries, not decades. And this is the new Penhurst Hospital? Chuck thought. What happened to the old one? It get demolished during the Big Bang? For the 100th time that day, Chuck wished his best friend were there to share in the joke. Chuck knew Stella and Ramon wouldn't laugh at it, but Augie would have. As the trio approached the hospital's main entrance, Chuck looked off to the distance, past Penhurst's vast gables, where the sun had started its descent. The sky went amber with slanting light, and purple clouds spread over it like bruises. The contrast in the late afternoon hour triggered another connection in Chuck's mind. Have you guys noticed how all the stories take place at night? Chuck asked his companions. Tommy, Augie, Ruth, all at night. Stella and Ramon exchanged a look but said nothing, and that silence told Chuck everything he needed to know. He was right, and another night was fast approaching. Getting past the battle-axe nurse at the front desk was a pain in the ass. If Stella had let Chuck do the talking, he could have easily improvised some song and dance, charmed the spinster, and probably gotten the three of them all-access passes. Instead, Stella had to try the mostly honest route, fat lot of good that did them. To make matters worse, a passing doctor said how the hospital's records were stored in the Red Room. Stella and Ramon's ears perked up. That's where they wanted to go. But Chuck almost wet himself for the second time that week at the sound of those three little words. What were the chances he would have dreamed twice about that bloated old broad warning him to keep away from a red room, only to have some shrink mention an off-limits red room? Chuck decided that if he survived this, whatever this was, he might try his hand at being a psychic to the stars. He'd wear a turban and a cape, the whole enchilada. All the late-night talk shows would be tripping over themselves to book the great Chuck Heaney so that he could tell celebrities their fortunes and bend spoons with his mind. Yeah, that's what Chuck would do. if he survived. With that new life goal in mind, Chuck reluctantly followed Stella and Ramon as they snuck past the distracted nurse's front desk. Slipping through a set of restricted access doors, the three high schoolers skidded to a halt at the intersection between two antiseptic hallways. A sign on the corner pointed to the left and read, "Red, Records and Evaluation Department." Their little search party signed in collective relief, and Ramon said, "So it's not actually red." Which was easy for Ramon to say. He wasn't the one who kept dreaming about pale ladies and weirdo warnings. Chuck rolled his eyes in aggravation. "It's called the Red Room," Chuck countered. "Who said it had to be red? Count me out." "Okay, stay here then," Stella said impatiently. "We'll be quick. Catch you later?" Chuck nodded nervously and said, "Not if you catch a disease first." It was their group's favorite rejoinder, and saying it gave Chuck's spirits a slight lift. He knew Stella and Ramon were eager to find the old hospital records of whoever authored the book that had been cursing them, but Chuck couldn't have cared less about some musty old medical charts, even if they were kept in a room that was painted with bright pink polka dots. No, Chuck Steinberg had his own reason for breaking into Penhurst Hospital. He watched Stella and Ramon run off toward the Red Room, which sounded ominous to Chuck even as an acronym, and dawdled in the crossroads between hallways for a minute longer, until a pair of nurses rounded one of the corners. Chuck tried to act casual, like he owned the joint, as he turned his back to the oncoming nurses and walked briskly down one of the perpendicular halls. He reached an elevator and ducked inside just before its automatic doors closed. The good news, as near as Chuck could tell, was that the elevator was empty, but the bad news, it was headed toward the roof. After an interminably long upward crawl, the elevator's undergreased cables straining and squealing like out-of-tune guitar strings, the doors opened with the most depressing ding Chuck had ever heard. "Jesus, who handles the repairs at this hospital? Dr. Frankenstein?" he mused. Chuck chuckled at his one-liner and stepped onto the roof. Disoriented by the dizzying height and the sudden chill in the air, he followed a walkway to the edge of the roof and peered down the side. Far below on the hospital grounds, two identical albino patients with matching haunted expressions smiled back at him. It seemed to Chuck that the brothers had been looking up to the roof before Chuck even peeked over the edge. The twins pointed at him in unison, their rictus smiles unchanging, their hospital gowns as bleached white as their hair. Chuck took a startled step back. Shaking off an unexpected case of vertigo, he heard one of the rooftop doorways open behind him. A pair of orderlies, beefy, brawny guys in bleached and pressed scrubs, walked out, making their rounds of the premises. Chuck guessed that some of the patients, would steal up here if they could. After all, flinging yourself off the roof would be one way to check out of Penhurst Hospital. "You know where you're going?" one of the orderlies asked. Chuck made a quick appraisal and decided that these guys probably weren't in a mood to hear the one about the priest, the rabbi, and the man who claimed he was Queen Victoria. Stalling for time, Chuck stammered. His eyes flicked to the side, and then he saw it. The sunset had turned the sky the deepest shade of red. Night was near. And so were the no-nonsense orderlies. Chuck kept his eyes glued to the ground and made a beeline for the second rooftop door. He passed through it and hustled down another hall, the orderlies following a few paces behind him. "Hey, you there!" one orderly called after him. "You're not supposed to be here." "No shit, Sherlock," thought Chuck. He rushed around the nearest corner, saw another open elevator, "Thank you, Dr. Frankenstein," and hit one of the buttons. But rather than take the ride down, Chuck hopped out of the elevator and into a supply closet on the opposite wall. He eased the doors shut and listened as the orderlies reached the elevator, which had just shut and begun its descent. Chuck heard the orderlies gripe on the other side of the closet door and run for the nearest staircase. They actually fell for it. The old empty elevator trick. Suckers, Chuck thought with supreme satisfaction. Then he took in his cramped surroundings. The supply closet was filled chock-a-block with wheelchairs in various states of disrepair, and the emergency floodlight overhead made the white-painted walls look stark raving red. Chuck instinctively ran through every swear word he knew in his head. So this is it. Trapped like a rat in a red room after all. Son of a... Only it wasn't a red room, Chuck soon realized. At least, not technically. This was a closet, complete with a water heater and a mop bucket and an insane number of wheelchairs, and that deeply disturbing dream lady with the pale skin and the midriff bulge and the black eyes that were too far apart didn't say anything about a closet. She specifically visited his nightmares in a room. Proud of himself for identifying the loophole in dream logic, Chuck dusted his shoulders and flicked the light switch to his side. The overhead bulb went from crimson to fluorescent white, and Chuck pumped his fist in the air victoriously. He could have kissed whatever lunatic stuffed all those goddamn wheelchairs in there. Finding one that was still mostly intact, Chuck sat in it. He kicked open the closet door and wheeled out into the hallway, which was remarkably, blessedly white. I love white, Chuck said cheerfully to no one in particular. White walls, white bread, white clothes. He passed an unattended laundry cart filled with all things, freshly washed white hospital coats. Chuck happily stood up and donned one of the coats, and then pushed an imaginary patient in the vacant wheelchair down the corridor. Maybe he was onto something with this psychic thing. Then Chuck stopped short. He took a few steps back and regarded the vending machine he'd just passed. Chuck wagged his eyebrows, feeling the much-needed turn his luck was taking, and said, "White chocolate." He patted his pockets and felt a few coins jingling within. After some digging, Chuck fished out enough and plunked them into the machine. He read the menu, then punched the code for the whitest candy bar on display. The metal coil holding the treat on display started to turn when the vending machine's lights flickered out. The bar remained stuck in place. "You trash can!" he yelled. Chuck snaked his arm up through the dispenser bin and toward the dangling candy, but it was just beyond his grasp. A frustrating turn of events, to be sure. But Chuck reasoned that if this turned out to be the worst thing to happen to him today, he'd still consider himself the most fortunate SOB on the planet. About to give up, he banged his fist on the cabinet. The white chocolate bar fell loose, followed by 3 more goodies. Chuck greedily grabbed up his winnings and tried to calculate how long it'd take to reach Atlantic City by bus. The great Chuckini was liking his odds. But when he heard some approaching adult voices, Chuck abandoned the wheelchair and retreated into the closest bathroom, only after he confirmed its walls were white too. He took the farthest stall, locked the door, and started to chow down on his chocolate. Night loomed beyond the windows, but Chuck couldn't care less. The sugar rush did wonders for his anxiety. 4 bars later. Those doctors loved to talk. Didn't they have any actual patients to visit? Chuck emerged from the john and made sure the coast was clear. Stuffing his hands in his purloined coat's pockets and whistling a carefree tune, he made a left, then a right, then another left, before encountering a long row of padlocked doors. Chuck had almost forgotten, in his overriding fear of red rooms, he nearly neglected his real reason for taking the long bus ride to Penhurst. Each door featured a small square window in its center. The glass contained a grid of strong metal wires that overlapped in a diamond pattern. Chuck was already hip to the reason why. A patient could punch through glass, but not wire. Chuck braved a glimpse into the first window, then the next. Both of those cells contained men. Well, sad heaps that used to be men. Then, Chuck approached a third door. He knew that comedy worked in threes. The first time, a crowd hears a good joke. It gets a laugh. The second time, it gets applause. But on the third time, the joke kills. The great Chuckini said a prayer and hoped his luck held, and took a breathless look into the third window. And there she was. "Ruthie?" Chuck said, his voice almost a whisper. The figure on the other side of the door stirred, barely visible in the faint moonlight coming from the barred skylight set high into the ceiling. Chuck gently tapped the reinforced glass and said, "Ruth, it's me. It's Chuck." The girl inside the cell turned. She had evidently undone the straitjacket that once confined her in the 24 hours since she'd been committed to Penhurst. The loose straps dangled from Ruth Steinberg's body like 8 extra appendages. I talked to Mom," Chuck added after getting no response from his sister. "She's gonna come visit you just as soon as she can. She's gonna bring the program, too, from your show. It's got your name on it, right under Bye Bye Birdie." Ruth moved so fast, Chuck didn't even have time to react. She slammed her whole body against the door. Chuck saw the hinges hold, but the cheap drab paint buckled and split. His sister hissed at him, then laughed, then probed her tongue around the inside of her mouth, as if trying to dislodge something crawling around in there. Now that their faces were separated by only 2 inches of tempered glass, Chuck could clearly see the scratches marring Ruth's once flawless skin. The clumps of blonde hair she'd torn from her once buoyant bouffant. "Ruthie?" Chuck said lamely. Ruth backed away from the door and said, "Did you hear the one about the spiders?" Chuck absent-mindedly shook his head no, and watched his sister disappear into the crushing black shadows of her padded cell. "They're under my skin, Chucko!" And that was the moment Chuck knew he'd never laugh again. He tore his eyes away from the space where his sister had vanished and ran down the remaining length of the insane asylum. Fists pounded and throats hollered behind the series of doors as Chuck fled past them. It was as if the poor lost souls like his sister's, could somehow pick up Chuck's current emotional state. It was as if they'd been deprived of their gruel for weeks, and now fed on his sickly sweet terror. Chuck forced himself to slow down. He walked cautiously forward to where he thought the exit to this ward might be located. The frenzy around him lessened somewhat, but some of the afflicted inhabitants of those cells still howled in protest. "I don't want my drum," said one of the patients, who was clearly in his late 60s. "I promised to be good. I want my mommy back." "Defago!" shouted another. "Defago!" Toward the end of the corridor, Chuck encountered an older assortment of cells. These ones had no doors or windows, but instead featured corroded metal bars akin to those found in an abandoned prison. Within one such confinement, a man tracked Chuck's movements with a dead stare. A hollow smile then appeared instantaneously on his face, in total contrast to the rest of the man's dour effect. Chuck's eyes drifted to the other side of the hall, where another deeply disturbed individual yanked off patches of his own scalp, stopping only long enough to look at the boy on the other side of the bars, whose face had drained of all color. Chuck could tell from the patchwork of scars on the man's skull that this tonsorial mutilation was a daily ritual. 2 warm globs then flew from opposite sides of the hall, synchronized to strike Chuck at the same moment. The smell hit Chuck well before he looked down and saw the brown smears on his stolen white doctor's coat. "That's fine. I deserve that," Chuck said, remembering what he'd done to Tommy Milner on Halloween. He backed up before more human feces could be sent his way, only to see the battle axe nurse from the reception desk, followed by another squad of orderlies. Her orthopedic shoes squeaked against the ammonia-squeaked floors. She pointed at Chuck and said, "I knew it. Grab him, and there are 2 more." Chuck bolted down the remaining stretch of the psych ward. Arms, some scarred, some riddled with poxy blisters, shot out from behind the bars and snatched at Chuck. If he had been in a joking mood, Chuck might have made some comment like, when she said grab him, I think she was talking to the staff, not the patients." But Chuck felt as humorless as he did trapped, so he kept mum. The sordid hands got a hold of his doctor's coat, but Chuck tore it off and kept running. He hooked a sharp turn and barged through a door labeled staircase. As the nurse, orderlies, and treatment subjects of Penner's all shrieked after him, Chuck charged onto the pitch-black spiral of stairs. He fumbled his way up a few flights. He lost count in his panic, and eventually exited onto another of the hospital's apparently endless supply of long corridors. But at least this one was empty. Chuck paused a moment to catch his breath, nearly hyperventilating from the exertion, and the memory of what had become of Ruth. As he doubled over, chest heaving, body hot and sweating under his clothing, Chuck failed to notice the subtle changes to his environment. Shadows that shouldn't have existed at nighttime crept into the corridor, sliding across the ceilings, walls, and floors as if cast by another array of prison bars. And the body heat wafting off, Chuck traveled in waves up to the ceiling, which started to melt. White paint and plaster slowly dripped from its surface. The liquid beads fattened and gathered into trickling rivulets. And those rivulets took on the aspect of the heels and toes, belonging to 2 padded feet. Those feet then pushed out of the ceiling, followed by legs. Behind Chuck's back, a humanoid shape slid down the wall to the floor. It was like some full-grown monstrosity birthed by the hospital itself. Alarms then went off across all of Penhurst, making Chuck jump. It wasn't just how loud the klaxons were, although their blare was ear-splitting. No, it was how the alarm's corresponding lights caused everything. The walls, floors, doors, ceilings, even Chuck himself, to turn red. He cried out in revulsion and stormed away just before the shape could touch him. "Help!" Chuck yelled. "Help! Help!" He hoped he might see Stella and Ramon barrel out one of the doors, with the key to sparing all of their lives. Hell, Chuck would have even settled for the battle axe nurse and her thuggish orderlies, but no one came for Chuck, except the pale lady. She stood at the distant end of the hallway before him, the paint plaster solidifying into the body from his nightmares. Black, unkept hair spilled down her head and framed her equally black eyes, which were set too far apart to be human. She grinned mirthlessly at Chuck, and her round belly shook with muted laughter, swaying her diaphanous gown. The pale lady took a step toward Chuck, and he spun around to the other way. Only the pale lady now waited for him at the opposite end of the hall. Chuck turned his head back and forth, looking both ways. The pale lady somehow staggered toward him from each direction at once. It was like there were 2 of her, only Chuck felt deep in his soul that there was only one. But no matter where he looked, the pale lady stood before him, getting closer with each glance. Noticing a third hallway branching off from the main 2, he flailed down it. But there she was again, the pale lady. Chuck scrambled backward, tried opening all of the locked doors around him. "Help! Help! Help!" he shouted again. Chuck knew he was awake, yet Chuck knew this was his dream too. His head spun, but wherever Chuck looked, she looked back at him with her black eyes and inscrutable grin. He felt all of Penner's hospital closing in on him. The deepening shadows, the insistent alarms, the red room, the pale lady stepping nearer, ever nearer. It doesn't make any sense, Chuck thought. She shuffled toward Chuck, only feet away, then inches. The pale lady opened her arms as if to greet Chuck in an embrace, and then Chuck remembered, jokes don't have to make any sense. Chuck backed against the wall, nowhere left to run, no place left to hide. The pale lady wrapped her gelatinous arms around him and enveloped his entire body into her own. As long as they're funny. Did you ever hear the one about my mom? She smothers me so much, I tell you, I feel like one of her Salisbury steaks. Get it?